In the spring of 1889, workers hired to renovate an old manor house in the Connecticut River Valley made a discovery that no one in that household wanted them to make. Hidden inside a sealed cavity between the original stone wall and a later addition of oak paneling, they found a bundle of letters, 17 of them, tied with a strip of black ribbon that had long since stiffened into something closer to wire. The foreman who opened the bundle said that he read only the first 3 lines of the first letter before folding it shut and walking off the property entirely. He never returned to collect his wages. The letters were addressed to a woman who had been dead for over 30 years. They described, in meticulous and damning detail, a series of events stretching back to the winter of 1843, events that the Aldridge family, one of the most respected names in Hartford County, had spent 4 decades and a considerable portion of their fortune ensuring would never be spoken aloud. What those letters contained did not merely embarrass the Aldridges. It ended them. Within 18 months of that discovery, the eldest son had fled to Canada under an assumed name. The family estate had been sold at auction to settle a cascade of legal claims. And the family patriarch, 81 years old, half-blind, and reportedly still insisting that everything was a fabrication, died in a rented room above a druggist's shop in Middletown, attended by no one. Before we continue with the story of the Aldridge family and the letters that destroyed them, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. What city? What state? We want to know who was out there in the dark with us. Because the dark, as the Aldridges discovered, has a very long memory. The Connecticut River Valley in the early decades of the 19th century was a place that believed deeply in its own respectability. The towns that lined the river, Middletown, Hartford, Wethersfield, Glastonbury, were old in the American sense of old, which is to say they had been established long enough that their founding families had forgotten what it felt like to be uncertain. The valley had grown prosperous on trade, river commerce, tobacco, insurance, manufacturing. By the 1840s, Hartford was the kind of city that sent its sons to Yale as a matter of routine, and expected them to return prepared to manage money, and manage institutions, and manage appearances, in roughly that order. That sequence, money, institutions, appearances, was not accidental. Appearances in the Connecticut of this era were a form of infrastructure. They sustained credit, which sustained commerce, which sustained the household and the name and the position. The management of appearances was not understood to be dishonesty. It was understood to be the ordinary work of a civilized community, the maintenance of the shared fiction that allows people of different stations to coexist within a common set of acknowledged rules. The rules in the Hartford of the 1840s were intricate. They concerned who could attend what church pew, who could serve on what committee, who could be visited and who could be called upon, who required an introduction and who required merely a greeting, and how those distinctions mapped onto a social hierarchy that was not formally codified anywhere but was understood by everyone who operated within it as precisely and automatically as a musical score is understood by a trained musician. This is the world into which Patience Cobb had been inserted as a young woman, and in which she had lived, as domestic servants live, simultaneously inside and outside the family's intimate life. She ate in the kitchen. She managed the functions of the household that made the household's social performances possible. She understood the machinery behind the performance in the way that stagehands understand it, from a vantage point that gives you, if you pay attention, a more complete picture of what is actually happening than the audience ever receives. The Aldridges had been managing appearances since at least 1701, when the first of them, a man named Cornelius Aldridge who had arrived from Rhode Island with a small amount of capital and a large amount of ambition, purchased a plot of farmland along the eastern bank of the river and began the slow work of becoming someone worth knowing. His descendants had done well by that project. By the time we reached the family story in the early 1840s, they were in their 4th generation of Connecticut prominence. They owned the manor house that would eventually be renovated, a profitable interest in a Hartford insurance concern, a smaller property in Glastonbury used for the cultivation of shade tobacco, and the kind of social position that does not need to announce itself because everyone already knows it is there. The head of the family in 1843 was a man named Harlan Aldridge, who was then in his mid-30s. He was, by all contemporary accounts, an effective and largely humorless man. He managed the insurance business with precision, served on the boards of 2 charitable institutions, attended services at Center Church in Hartford with a kind of regularity that communicates not devotion but status, and had been married since 1838 to a woman named Eliza née Storrow, who had come from a respectable Springfield family, and who everyone agreed was considerably more perceptive than her husband, though no one would have said so to his face. They had 3 children by 1843. The eldest, a boy named Harlan Jr., called Henry within the family to distinguish him from his father, was 5 years old. There were 2 younger daughters. The household also included, in the manner of prosperous Connecticut families of the period, a number of domestic servants, a groundskeeper, and a woman named Patience Cobb, who functioned as housekeeper, and who had worked for the Aldridge family since before Harlan Sr. had married Eliza, since before Harlan Sr. had taken over the business from his own father, since before, some said, the house itself had acquired its reputation for cold rooms and drafts that appeared with no clear source. Patience Cobb was 53 years old in 1843. She was a widow whose husband had died of a chest ailment in the winter of 1831, leaving her without children and with no property of her own. She had come to work for the Aldridges as a young woman, and the house had in some sense become the whole of her world. She knew where everything was. She knew the habits of every room. And she knew this will become significant things about the family that the family did not know she knew. The winter of 1843 arrived early and stayed long in the Connecticut River Valley. By November, the river had already begun to show ice at its margins, and the roads between Hartford and the outlying towns turned treacherous with a combination of mud and frozen ruts that made travel both difficult and, when a wheel broke or a horse stumbled, genuinely dangerous. It was into this winter, gray, close, and unforgiving, that the events began to move that would eventually be sealed inside a wall and forgotten, or nearly forgotten, for 46 years. The night of December 3, 1843, was not a night anyone at the Aldridge estate was meant to remember for any particular reason. Harlan Sr. had returned from Hartford in the late afternoon, arriving at the house as the sky was darkening over the river and the temperature had dropped sharply from its midday level, the kind of Connecticut winter evening where the cold feels deliberate, where the bare trees along the drive stand in the failing light like figures that have chosen not to move. He had arrived in better spirits than was usual, which Patience Cobb noted in her letters with the precision of someone who has tracked a man's moods long enough to know when a change in them means something. He had brought company. A young man named Daniel Ferris, 26 years old, recently engaged to be married, hired as a clerk in the insurance office, had arrived at the manor house that afternoon in the company of Harlan Sr. and had been invited to stay the night given the worsening weather. He was, by Patience Cobb's brief description, a young man of pleasant manners and a certain eager-to-please quality that people in subordinate professional positions sometimes develop when they understand that their advancement depends on the goodwill of a specific person. He thanked Patience Cobb for the preparation of the guest room. He carried his own bag upstairs. He was, by all visible signs, an ordinary guest in ordinary circumstances. This detail, the presence of Daniel Ferris, would become, in retrospect, the hinge on which everything else turned. What is known, or what can be reconstructed from the evidence that later emerged, is this: Daniel Ferris did not sleep in the guest room he was assigned that night. At some point between 10 in the evening and 3 in the morning, he was somewhere else in the house. And sometime during those same hours, Eliza Aldridge was not in the bedroom she shared with her husband, who was, according to his own later account, sleeping with the help of a preparation of laudanum he had been prescribed for a recurring pain in his back. What is also known is that Patience Cobb, whose room was on the ground floor near the kitchen, did not sleep at all that night. She heard things. The house made its ordinary nighttime sounds, the settling of old stone against newer wood, the movement of air through corridors that had never been entirely sealed against the winter, the distant sound of the river if the wind was right. But she heard beneath those ordinary sounds something that was not ordinary. Footsteps that did not belong to the pattern of a household at rest. A door that opened and did not immediately close. Voices, very low, in the corridor above the kitchen. Not words, nothing she could transcribe. But voices, and a specific emotional register she recognized, the specific low urgency of people who do not want to be heard. She saw, through a partially open door, something she was not meant to see. And she wrote it down. Not immediately. Not that night. But within the following days, in a letter addressed to her sister in New Haven, a letter she ultimately did not send, but kept instead, folded inside a larger bundle that she added to over the following years with the methodical, quiet precision of someone who understands that truth, if it is to be useful, must be preserved in a form that will survive. The morning after Daniel Ferris spent the night at the Aldridge estate, he left before breakfast. Harlan Sr. saw him off at the door and parted from him in the ordinary manner of an employer bidding a valued employee a comfortable journey. Eliza did not come downstairs until mid-morning. She complained of a headache. The children were kept in the nursery. 3 weeks later, Daniel Ferris resigned his position at the insurance concern, citing a desire to pursue an opportunity in Boston. Harlan Sr. provided him with a letter of recommendation that was, by the standards of such letters, unusually warm. Ferris departed for Boston in January of 1844 and did not, as far as the official record goes, have any further contact with the Aldridge family. But the official record, as Patience Cobb well understood, was not the only kind. What Patience Cobb had seen through that partially open door on the night of December the 3rd was not by itself necessarily the thing that unraveled everything. Affairs among the wealthy classes of mid-19th century New England were not precisely common knowledge, but neither were they unheard of. What made the Cobb letters, for that is what they eventually became, the Cobb letters, at least in the minds of the few people who knew they existed, different from a simple account of marital infidelity was what Patience Cobb understood about the context in which that night had occurred. To explain this, it is necessary to go back slightly further in the story, to the summer and autumn of 1843, before Daniel Ferris arrived at the manor house with Harlan Sr. on that cold December afternoon. In the summer of 1843, a young woman named Mercy Dunbar had come to work at the Aldridge estate as a household servant. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a farming family from Glastonbury, brought in to help with the increased labor the household required after one of the other servants had left to be married. Mercy Dunbar was, by all accounts, a quiet and industrious girl, not without intelligence, and possessing a directness of manner that Patience Cobb would later describe in her letters as both her greatest quality and the quality that most imperiled her. By September of 1843, Mercy Dunbar had attracted the attention of Harlan Aldridge Sr. in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Patience Cobb saw this. She had worked for the family long enough to recognize what she was looking at. She had also worked for the family long enough to understand that the correct response in the practical calculus of her position was to see nothing, say nothing, and file everything away in the part of her mind where other such things were already filed. What complicated the situation, and what gave Patience Cobb's eventual account its particular weight, was that Eliza Aldridge also saw what was happening. And Eliza Aldridge, who was, as everyone agreed, considerably more perceptive than her husband, drew a conclusion that her husband had apparently not considered, that the best way to redirect a dangerous situation was to provide a substitute for the danger. Daniel Ferris was not, in other words, a random choice. He was a young man of relatively modest means and significant ambitions, employed in her husband's own business, and therefore someone whose discretion could be reasonably counted upon. He was also, and Patience Cobb recorded this with the careful precision of someone who understood she was writing history, someone for whom Eliza Aldridge had developed a genuine attachment over the preceding year through the ordinary social contacts of a businessman's household. Dinners, holiday gatherings, the incidental proximity of a small professional world. Whether Eliza's calculation was correct, whether she believed that redirecting her husband's attention by occupying her own was a rational strategy, or whether the rationalization came later to explain something that had happened for simpler reasons, is a question the letters leave open. What they do not leave open is the sequence of events, or the fact that Patience Cobb, unfazed from her position of invisible domestic authority, had observed most of it with the thoroughness of a woman who had learned over decades of service that the powerful are observed most accurately by those they have learned to look through. By the spring of 1844, Mercy Dunbar had left the Aldridge household. The official reason given was that she had returned to her family in Glastonbury. Patience Cobb's letters suggest a different story. They suggest that Mercy Dunbar had left because she had been given a sum of money and a clear understanding of what would happen to her family's tenancy on Aldridge land. The Dunbars rented from an estate connected to the Aldridge tobacco interest. If she failed to depart quietly and permanently, this too Patience Cobb had seen, and this too she had written down. The years following 1844 were, on the surface, years of consolidation and quiet success for the Aldridge family. Harlan Sr. expanded the insurance concern. The elder son Henry was sent to a preparatory school in New Haven, then to Yale as expected. The daughters made respectable marriages. Eliza Aldridge became, as the decades passed, the kind of matriarch who was praised for her composure and her charitable work, a woman whose early beauty had settled into a kind of serene authority. If she and Harlan Sr. had an understanding between them, if the events of December 1843 had produced not rupture but a particular kind of equilibrium, a shared knowledge that bound them together in the way that only mutual compromises can, it showed itself nowhere visible. They appeared to the world as they had always appeared. Patience Cobb watched all of this. And she continued to work for the family until her own age and failing health required her to retire in 1871, at which point she accepted a pension from the estate and moved to the home of a niece in Middletown. She was 71 years old. She took with her, in a cloth-covered document box that had belonged to her husband, the letters she had been writing and accumulating for 28 years. She died in 1875. The box passed to the niece, who had been told clearly and repeatedly not to open it, to hold it intact, and to surrender it if anyone ever came asking, only to Eliza Aldridge herself or to her direct heirs, and only if they came asking honestly, which meant only if they came asking because they already knew what was inside. No one came. Eliza Aldridge died in 1877. Harlan Sr. outlived her by 12 years, dying in 1889, the same year the workers opened the wall. In those intervening years between Patience Cobb's retirement and her death, and the years after, the Aldridge family went on performing the rituals of Connecticut prosperity with the automatic fluency of people who have never had reason to question whether performance and reality were the same thing. The manor house was improved. New rooms added to the eastern wing. The original stone foundations reinforced. Certain sections of interior wall rebuilt to accommodate updated plumbing and heating arrangements. It was during one of these earlier renovations, sometime in the late 1850s or early 1860s, that the cavity in the wall had been created, or at least altered to its final form. Who placed the letters there is not entirely clear from the documentary record, but the timing suggests it was after Patience Cobb had left domestic service. The question of whether she placed them there herself, on some final visit to the house, or through some intermediary, or whether they arrived in the wall by a different chain of hands, is one of the small unresolved questions that the story leaves permanently open. What is easier to account for is why they were placed there at all, rather than burned or kept openly or surrendered to a lawyer. The answer, when you think carefully about the position Patience Cobb occupied, is not mysterious. A domestic servant who possessed documents damaging to her employer was not, in the mid-19th century Connecticut River Valley, someone with a great many options for how to use them. She could not publish them. She could not give them to a lawyer in her own right, since the legal system of the period offered limited standing to a woman of her station and no standing at all to someone making claims against a family like the Aldridges without substantial resources to sustain a proceeding. She could try to extract some benefit by threatening disclosure, but this was a strategy that required a willingness to be destroyed in the process, because the Aldridges had tools for discrediting a domestic servant that she had no tools to answer. What she could do, and did, was keep. She kept the letters because keeping them was the only form of preservation available to her. And she placed them eventually somewhere they would not be destroyed by accident or by the tidying impulses of a household that would otherwise have had every reason to clear out the papers of an elderly retired housekeeper. A wall is not a safe. But a wall is permanent in a way that a drawer or trunk or document box left to a niece is not quite permanent enough. The wall held them for somewhere between 20 and 30 years. It held them through 2 changes of household staff, through the deaths of both of Henry Aldridge's parents, through the conversion of several rooms from their original purpose to new ones, and through the ordinary erosion of time on a house that is maintained but not loved, kept functional but not cherished, operated as a property rather than inhabited as a home. And then the workers came with their tools in the spring of 1889. and then the wall gave them up. And the foreman read 3 lines and walked away. And the story that Patience Cobb had spent 28 years writing down began at last its journey toward the light. The niece, whose name was Clara Howd, was still alive in 1889. She had kept the box for 14 years undisturbed. And when she read in the Middletown newspaper a brief item about renovations being undertaken at the old Aldridge estate, she made a decision. She did not send the letters to the family. She sent them to the family's lawyer, not the current family lawyer, but the previous one, a man named Solomon Graves, who had retired from practice in Hartford and was known in a general way to have accumulated over his long career a quantity of information about powerful families that made him a person worth staying on reasonable terms with. Solomon Graves received the box from Clara Howd in April of 1889. He read its contents over 3 days. Then he wrote 2 letters. The first was to Henry Aldridge Harlan Jr., now in his early 50s, the family patriarch in his father's absence. The second was to a man Henry Aldridge had never heard of, a journalist in New Haven. He sent both letters on the same afternoon. Henry Aldridge received Solomon Graves' letter on a Wednesday morning in late April. He read it standing in the hallway of the Hartford house, a newer townhouse than the old manor estate, purchased a decade earlier when the manor had become impractical to maintain. His wife later reported that she knew from the look on his face, before he had said a single word, that something had shifted in the architecture of their lives. The letter from Solomon Graves was, by the standards of blackmail, for that is ultimately what it was, performed with the careful indirection of a former lawyer who understood precisely how close to a line he could walk, a masterpiece of its genre. It did not threaten. It informed. It conveyed the existence of a collection of letters describing events involving the Aldridge family between 1843 and 1871. It noted that these letters had recently come into Graves' possession, and that he had read them with considerable attention. It expressed, in measured and almost sympathetic language, concern about what might happen were their contents to become known to persons outside the legal and confidential context in which Graves was sharing this information. And it concluded with a suggestion that a meeting between Graves and Henry Aldridge, at a time and place of Aldridge's choosing, might be productive for all parties. It said nothing about the journalist in New Haven. That letter, sent the same afternoon, told a different story to a different audience. What finally moved Henry Aldridge to respond was not the letter from Graves. It was a conversation 3 days after receiving Graves' letter with a distant cousin who lived in New Haven and who mentioned, in the course of an apparently casual social call, that he had heard something interesting. A journalist he knew, a man named Edwin Pell, who wrote for one of the smaller New Haven papers, had been approached with a story about an old Connecticut family. The cousin didn't know the details. He had thought Henry would want to know. Henry Aldridge understood, in the space of that conversation, what Solomon Graves had actually done. The letter to the family and the letter to the journalist had not been alternative strategies deployed in sequence. They had been simultaneous. Graves had not offered Henry Aldridge a private settlement in preference to public exposure. He had offered both at once. And the letter to the journalist was not a threat to be deployed if negotiations failed. It was already deployed, already in motion, and already introducing the story of the Aldridge family into a world that Henry Aldridge could not fully see or control. The reason for this, why Graves would take an approach that maximized his leverage but also maximized the risk of actual exposure, became clearer when Henry Aldridge began asking careful questions of people who knew Solomon Graves. What he learned was that Graves, now in his late 60s, was not well. He had a condition of the liver that his physicians expected would be fatal within the year. He had no heirs. He had, over a long career handling the private disasters of prosperous families, accumulated a great deal of knowledge that he had never been able to convert to the kind of security he wanted. Not blackmail money exactly, but something more like acknowledgement, recognition, the satisfaction of being known even by one person as someone who had held power over power and had used it according to his own judgment. He was, in other words, not maneuvering for money. He was maneuvering for consequence. He wanted to see what happened. This understanding did not make Henry Aldridge's position easier. It made it considerably harder. Because a man who wants money can be bought. And a man who wants revenge has a price that can sometimes be identified and paid. But a man who wants to watch, who has arranged the pieces on a board and is simply waiting to see them move, is a man who is not, in any straightforward sense, negotiating at all. The story appeared in the New Haven paper on June 14, 1889. It was not, by the standards of later journalism, a long piece. It covered perhaps 4 columns, and it was written with the careful hedging of a journalist who understood libel law and the difference between what he knew and what he could prove. But it was specific. It named the Aldridge family. It described the general nature of the letters and the circumstances of their discovery. It reported what could be confirmed about Mercy Dunbar's background and employment at the estate. And it reported, in guarded but unmistakable language, the documented connection between Harlan Aldridge Sr. and the Commerce Street establishment. The New Haven paper had a circulation of modest size, but stories travel in ways that circulation figures do not capture. And this particular story traveled quickly. It was picked up within a week by a Hartford paper, and then by a Springfield paper, each with their own additions and framings, each adding the particular texture of a community that had known the Aldridge family in some capacity and now found itself looking at what it had known through a new lens. The Hartford piece was notably cautious, Hartford being a city where the Aldridges had social connections that a local editor would have been aware of. But caution, when it takes the form of carefully worded non-denial, communicates almost as much as assertion. What the initial coverage did not include, because Pell had not yet received the physician's document, was any account of what had happened to Mercy Dunbar after 1845. The first article described her as a young woman who had been employed by the family and then removed from that employment under circumstances that raised questions. The questions it raised were serious enough. They situated Harlan Aldridge Sr. within a pattern of behavior toward a vulnerable employee that readers of 1889, not all readers, not readers everywhere, but readers in the kind of reforming northeastern city that Hartford and New Haven had become, were primed to evaluate with a severity that would not have been universal 20 years earlier. The temperance movement had changed certain conversations. The emerging discourse around the condition of working women, the investigations into industrial labor that had produced legislative attention in Massachusetts and Connecticut both, and the spreading influence of settlement house reformers who documented what actually happened to young women of limited means when the systems supposedly designed to protect them failed, all of this had created, by 1889, an audience that knew how to read between the careful lines of a newspaper story and identify the reality being described. The follow-up piece in August did this serious damage. By August, Pell had been in correspondence with people. The first article had shaken loose at people who had known the Aldridges in the 1840s, people who had known Griselda Vane's establishment, and people who existed in that stratum of a mid-19th century city that keeps its own records even when the official records are silent. One of these correspondents provided a document that Pell had not expected to find, a record kept by a physician who had provided irregular services to Vane's establishment in the late 1840s. The physician was dead. The record had passed through a chain of transfers too complicated to summarize into the possession of a medical society that had not examined it. It contained, among other entries, a reference to a young woman referred to by a first name consistent with Mercy Dunbar's, receiving treatment in the spring of 1845 for a condition. The physician's careful notation described in the language of the period, which was obscure, but which Pell had shown to 2 practicing physicians who confirmed its meaning without ambiguity. The follow-up article said, as plainly as it dared, that Mercy Dunbar had not merely been removed from the Aldridge household, she had been removed from the Aldridge household under circumstances that had produced consequences for her health and her life that the Aldridge family, specifically Harlan Aldridge Sr., had subsequently done nothing to address or acknowledge. Whether Mercy Dunbar had survived, whether she was alive in 1889 somewhere in New England or beyond, living under her own name or another, Pell could not determine. He said so in the article. He asked anyone with information about a woman named Mercy Dunbar, born in Glastonbury, Connecticut approximately 1826, to contact him. 3 people did. None of their accounts could be verified. One of them described a woman who had died in New Haven in 1852. One described a woman living in Springfield in 1889 under a different name who might or might not have been the same person. The third sent a brief and signed note that said only, "She survived." It was not signed. It had a Boston postmark. Pell published all three responses in a third article in October. He added a reflection of his own, which is perhaps the line most frequently quoted from the entire episode: "The records of powerful families are the records they choose to keep. And the records of women like Mercy Dunbar are the records that survive by accident, in the margins of other people's accounts, dependent for their existence on the persistence of someone who thought they mattered." The someone in this case had been Patience Cobb, a widow, a domestic servant, a woman who had worked in a house for decades and had understood, in the particular way of people who are present without being seen, that the truth of a household is not found in its formal documents or its public record. It is found in what happens at 3 a.m, when the family thinks the house is asleep. The legal remedies Henry Aldridge had threatened never materialized. His lawyers, reviewing the specific claims made in the 3 articles against the documented basis Pell had established, concluded that a lawsuit would produce discovery that would be considerably more damaging than anything already published. There was no suit. What followed was not dramatic in the way of legal proceedings or public confrontations. It was the quieter drama of a family's position simply ceasing to be maintained. Institutions that had included Aldridges on their boards found, in the months following the articles, that the association had become complicated. Business relationships that had depended on the social weight of the Aldridge name found the same thing. The insurance concern, which had been profitable for decades, found its management transition. Henry Aldridge was in the process of handing day-to-day operations to a younger partner, complicated by questions no one asked aloud but that everyone was asking. The estate was put up for auction in the autumn of 1891. The old manor house, the tobacco property in Glastonbury, the Hartford townhouse, all of it went over the course of 18 months of legal proceedings to satisfy a combination of debts and settlements that the Aldridge family's reduced income and social position could no longer service. The auction of the manor house contents was reported in the Hartford Courant in a single paragraph, which noted that the house had been purchased by a manufacturing concern that planned to demolish the original structure and use the property for a different purpose. It made no mention of the wall. Henry Aldridge left Hartford in 1892. He went to Canada, as had been reported, specifically to Montreal, where he had a connection through the insurance industry and where his family name meant nothing. He lived there until 1907, working in a modest administrative capacity for a commercial firm, and died without having returned to Connecticut. Whether he died in peace or in something else is not recorded. Harlan Aldridge Sr., the patriarch, the man whose actions in the winter of 1843 had set all of this in motion, died in the Middletown rented room in the autumn of 1889, a few months after the first article appeared. He had been informed of its publication. His reaction, as reported by the druggist whose shop was below his room and who was the closest thing he had to an attendant in those final weeks, was to say that it was all lies and fabrications. That he had never done anything that was not in accordance with his position and his times. And that the people responsible for spreading such material were no better than common criminals. He said this more than once. He said it with conviction. He was not, as far as anyone could observe, troubled by doubt. This is, perhaps, the most unsettling detail in the entire story. Not the events themselves, not the letters in the wall, not the trail of documents that Patience Cobb assembled across 3 decades, but the old man in the rented room, insisting until his last days that he had done nothing wrong. Because he was speaking, in some sense, from inside the logic of his own world. The world in which his position entitled him to certain behaviors, in which the people below him in that world existed primarily in relation to his needs, in which the management of consequences was simply what a man of his standing did when circumstances required it. He was not performing innocence. He believed it. The man who had set every domino falling was neither Solomon Graves nor Edwin Pell nor any of the named participants in the Unraveling. It was Patience Cobb, dead 14 years before any of it happened, who had spent 28 years of service to a family, writing down with careful and uncompromising attention the things they would have preferred to vanish. She had not done it, apparently, to destroy them. Her letters, in their tone, are not angry documents. They are witnessing documents. She wrote in the manner of someone who believes that what happens deserves to be recorded, not because recording it will fix anything, not because justice is guaranteed, but because the alternative, the wall, the official version, the story that the powerful tell about themselves, is its own kind of harm. She was right about that. And the foreman who walked off the property without collecting his wages on the day the wall was opened was, in his small and practical way, also right. Some things, once you have read the first 3 lines, you understand you are not going to be able to put down. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Do you think Mercy Dunbar sent that unsigned letter from Boston? Leave your comment below, ***. If this kind of history, the kind that lives in the walls and survives the families it witnessed, is the kind that keeps you up at night, then subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell and share this with someone who needs to hear it, ***. We will be back in the dark. We will see you in the next story, ***.